Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of From Protest to Revolution. Our questions to think about here: which events took the American colonists down the road from protest to rebellion and then to revolution? King George III had replaced George Grenville with Lord Rockingham, who was a leader of a Whig faction that had been critical of Grenville's colonial policies. In 1766, Rockingham asked Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, which they did. But Parliament also passed the Declaratory Act, which asserted the power of Parliament over the colonies. So this is an interesting moment in parliamentary history because the Parliament has recognized that the American protests are active. But at the same time, they are saying that Parliament does in fact have power over the colonies because they just said so. That's what the Declaratory Act effectively does. In July 1766, the king then replaced Lord Rockingham with William Pitt, a former prime minister. But Pitt, because of illness, frequently deferred to other cabinet members, which allowed Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to exert excessive influence over colonial policies. It's going to be Charles Townshend who authorizes the duties on goods exported from England, which had to be collected in colonial ports. Townshend also proposed to use the revenues to pay colonial governors and other officers, thereby releasing them from financial dependence upon the colonial assemblies. This is kind of a brilliant move. So when you look at some textbooks, they will refer to these as the Townshend Acts, but they're also called the Revenue Acts. And the reason this is brilliant is because the colonial legislatures had always had the power over the salaries of custom agents and other government officials. And therefore, if those government officials were not doing what the legislators wanted, they could always reduce their salaries as economic leverage. But what Parliament has done here is effectively taken that power away. In protest, once again, the colonists boycotted the purchase of imported British goods. They began to make their own clothing, which leads some historians to call this the age of homespun. And they began to develop their own manufacturing. Remember when we talked about the relationship between the metropole and the colonies, I mentioned that it was the job of the colonies to provide the raw materials and to serve as a market for manufactured goods. The development of manufacturing would have been discouraged in the colonies because that manufacturing would compete with the manufacturing of the metropole, in this case, Britain. But now, during these colonial protests, we finally see the development of manufacturing in the British North American colonies. By 1770, the American non-importation and non-consumption agreements were strangling British trade and actually causing unemployment in England. With 4,000 British soldiers in Boston, tensions were very high, and on March 5, 1770, protesters began to heckle the British troops, and a soldier fired into the crowd and mayhem followed. In the end, 5 colonists were dead and 8 more were wounded. The Sons of Liberty and other colonial protesters are going to latch onto this moment and use it as part of a propaganda campaign. The so-called Boston Massacre was plastered all over colonial newspapers from Massachusetts to Georgia. And in April of 1770, Parliament repealed all of the Townshend Acts except for the tea tax. Most of the British troops had left Boston, but remained nearby. In 1773, Lord North tried to help some friends bail out the East India Company, which needed to sell its tea stored in warehouses in order to stay afloat. It's important to understand that the British East India Company is the largest corporation within the British Empire. And the fear was that if this corporation went bankrupt, it would have a huge negative effect on the British economy. So there's going to be a noticeable effort within the British Parliament to assist this corporation. It's basically a bailout. The Tea Act of 1773 allowed the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the American colonies without going through English merchants or other middlemen, thereby undercutting the merchants along with their colonial competitors, who were mostly smugglers who bought their tea from the Dutch. Tea, now even with the tax, was much cheaper than before. But the protesters argued that Parliament was trying to trick them to accept the tax through the disguise of cheap tea, because honestly, who doesn't like cheap tea? But it also cut out the colonial merchants as the middlemen. And so knowing that these British East India Company ships are on their way from England to the colonies are preparing to stop the importation of this tea. This is going to happen in several colonial ports, but of course the most famous incident is once again in Boston. On December 16, 1773, colonists loosely disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 British ships and threw 342 chests of East India Company tea into the harbor. We're talking about roughly $1 million in today's money of product that is being tossed into the sea. In 1774, Parliament enacted punishment through the Coercive Acts. So this is a response to the Boston Tea Party. The colonists are going to call the Coercive Acts the Intolerable Acts. The Boston Port Act closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for. The Quartering Act requires the local authorities to provide lodging in the city for British soldiers, and the Massachusetts Government Act made all of the colony's civic officers appointed rather than elected, and no town meeting could be held without the royal governor's consent. The Coercive Acts were designed to isolate Boston and Massachusetts from the other colonies. So the idea was, if we punish Massachusetts, we make them an example, and hopefully the other colonies clean up their act. Instead, this pressure on Boston actually helps to bring the colonies together. On September 5th, 1774, the 55 delegates making up the First Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia. I want to draw attention to the name of this group of delegates, Continental Congress. Congress simply means meeting. We saw it with the Stamp Act Congress. And then Continental is a reference to all of the colonies together. The delegates adopted a Declaration of American Rights, which proclaimed the rights of Americans as British subjects, and they denied Parliament's authority to regulate their internal colonial affairs. They also recommended that every community enforce an absolute boycott of all imported British goods. In April of 1775, the British government declared that the Massachusetts colony was in rebellion, and British General Thomas Gage decided to arrest rebel leaders and to seize the militia's gunpowder stored in Concord, Massachusetts. When the colonists discovered this plan, they sent out Paul Revere and William Dawes to warn the rebels. and Paul Revere reached Lexington, Massachusetts at about midnight and met with rebel leaders John Hancock and Sam Adams. On April 19th, the British came upon about 70 Minutemen lined up on the Lexington Square. After a brief skirmish, about 8 Minutemen were killed and 10 were wounded. The British officers then brought their troops under control and continued down the road to Concord. At Concord, the so-called Patriots, the Minutemen, stood firm and forced a British retreat. All along the road back to Boston, colonials took shots at the retreating troops, who ended up suffering 3 times as many casualties as the Americans. The Second Continental Congress then met in Philadelphia in May of 1775. In June, that Congress named George Washington as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, newly created Continental Army. And again, I want to draw your attention to the word continental here. Each of the colonies had always maintained their own militia to provide for local defenses, mostly against Native Americans. But this is a continental army, and the selection of George Washington is important because George Washington was from Virginia, not Massachusetts. So the idea is there is a message being sent to the British government. This is not a Massachusetts thing. This is an all of us thing, a continental thing. In June of 1775, the colonial forces fortified the high ground overlooking Boston at Breed's Hill. The British regular army attacked the colonials in 2 waves, both of which were repelled by the colonials. On the third attempt to dislodge the colonials from Breed's Hill, the British were successful, but it cost them over 1,000 casualties. And despite the fact that the major fighting took place on Breed's Hill, this incident is known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. The high number of British casualties made the British generals more cautious in subsequent encounters with the Continental Army. The colonials asked that all able-bodied men enlist in the militia. In July of 1775, the Continental Congress appealed to King George III with the so-called Olive Branch Petition, in which they professed their loyalty to the king and asked him to reconcile with the colonies. But when this document was presented to King George III, he refused to even look at it. He declared the American colonists to be traitors to the British crown. So think about it. We are now in the summer of 1775, and the question comes up, what are they fighting for? For some, the conflict was an attempt to force the British Parliament to acquiesce to the colonists' demands. It is probable that most people in the colonies did not foresee or desire a separation from Britain. They viewed themselves as Englishmen. I mean, we go back to the aftermath of the French and Indian War. Nobody celebrated more enthusiastically than the American colonists. They were so proud to be British subjects. For others, the previous 150 years of relative autonomy demonstrated that they didn't need Britain meddling in their affairs. The current strife was viewed as an opportunity to break away from British control permanently. So coming back to our questions to think about, which events took the American colonists down the road from protest to rebellion and then to revolution? We had mentioned before the Stamp Act Congress and the protests created by the Sons of Liberty. But with the Townshend Act, or the Revenue Acts of 1767, we see a greater widespread protest with the Boston Massacre, and then later the Boston Tea Party. And it's that harsh response to the Boston Tea Party that helps to bring the colonists once again closer together. The First Continental Congress is simply trying to proclaim the rights of the American colonists as Englishmen. But when that is rejected, and when the Olive Branch Petition is rejected, there starts to be a growing sentiment within the American colonies that they just don't need Britain anymore.